Ethan Parker used to believe that loyalty was the simplest promise two people could make. When he and Lucas Bennett first moved to Texas, Ethan thought they were beginning the kind of life couples dreamed about but rarely achieved. The city they left behind in Chicago had been loud and restless, full of crowded trains and late-night diners, but Texas offered something different. Lucas had called it a fresh start, a place where his real estate career could grow and where they could finally slow down together. For the first few months, Ethan believed him. Their small apartment overlooked a quiet street lined with oak trees, and in the evenings the sky turned a soft amber that Ethan had never seen in Chicago. Lucas would stand by the window with his sleeves rolled up, talking excitedly about property deals and new clients. Ethan would sit at the kitchen counter finishing design work on his laptop while listening to Lucas describe the future they were supposedly building together. Lucas had always been charming. That charm was the reason Ethan fell in love with him 3 years earlier. They had met at a mutual friend's birthday party, and Lucas had immediately drawn attention with his confident laugh and easy smile. Ethan had been quieter, more observant, but Lucas noticed him anyway. By the end of the evening, Lucas had convinced Ethan to join him for late-night coffee, and their relationship had begun with the kind of momentum that made everything feel inevitable. Back then, Lucas had made Ethan feel chosen. But sometime after the move to Texas, subtle changes began creeping into their routine. At first Ethan dismissed them as normal stress. Lucas was working longer hours, chasing new deals and trying to prove himself in a competitive market. Ethan told himself that ambition came with sacrifices. Still, the small signs accumulated. Lucas started answering messages with his phone turned away. He began stepping outside to take calls that he used to handle in the living room. Sometimes he returned home long after midnight, offering quick explanations about client dinners or networking events. Ethan tried not to question him too much. Trust, he believed, meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Whenever doubt appeared in his mind, he pushed it away. One evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, Ethan noticed Lucas smiling down at his phone. "Good news?" Ethan asked lightly. Lucas glanced up, almost startled. "Yeah. Just a client confirming a meeting tomorrow." The answer sounded harmless, but the phone disappeared quickly into Lucas's pocket, as if the conversation attached to it needed to remain hidden. Moments like that repeated themselves more often. Ethan told himself he was imagining things. Weeks passed, and the apartment that once felt warm began to feel strangely divided. Lucas's presence was still there, his jackets draped over chairs, his coffee mug in the sink, but emotionally he seemed somewhere else entirely. One Friday afternoon Ethan decided to surprise him. Lucas had mentioned an important meeting at the real estate office, and Ethan thought bringing coffee might brighten the long day. The gesture felt simple, something couples did for each other without thinking. The office building stood downtown, tall and sleek against the Texas sky. Ethan walked inside carrying 2 cups of coffee, smiling to himself as he imagined Lucas's reaction. The receptionist wasn't at her desk, and the hallway leading toward the conference rooms was quiet. As Ethan approached Lucas's office, he heard laughter. At first he smiled, assuming Lucas was entertaining a client. But the laughter sounded different from the polite professional tone Ethan had heard before. It was softer, more personal. Ethan slowed his steps. The conference room door stood slightly open, and through the narrow gap Ethan caught a glimpse of Lucas. Lucas wasn't alone. A man Ethan had never seen before stood close beside him, their conversation low and familiar. Lucas leaned toward the man with an intimacy that felt unmistakable. When Lucas's hand rested briefly on the other man's arm, the gesture carried a familiarity that no explanation could disguise. For a moment Ethan simply stared. His mind tried to construct alternate meanings, desperate to reinterpret what he was seeing. But the expressions on their faces erased any doubt. Lucas wasn't behaving like a businessman closing a deal. He was behaving like someone who had already made another choice. The coffee cups trembled slightly in Ethan's hands. Lucas glanced toward the door then, and the moment his eyes met Ethan's, the warmth in his expression vanished. Surprise replaced it, followed quickly by something that looked suspiciously like guilt. "Ethan?" Lucas stepped away from the other man, his voice suddenly cautious. The room felt smaller as Ethan pushed the door open. "I thought you said you had a meeting," Ethan said quietly. Lucas looked at the man beside him, then back at Ethan. "It's not what you think." Ethan almost laughed at the familiar phrase. "Then explain it." The other man shifted awkwardly and picked up his jacket. "I should go," he muttered before slipping past Ethan and leaving the room. Silence filled the space he left behind. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, clearly searching for the right words. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." The sentence landed heavier than any confession. "How long?" Ethan asked. Lucas hesitated just long enough to reveal the truth. "A few months," he admitted. Ethan felt something inside him collapse, not loudly, but completely. Months meant the betrayal had started not long after they moved. Months meant every late night and secret message had carried meaning. "You said we moved here for us," Ethan said. Lucas avoided his eyes. "Things just happened. It doesn't have to be a big deal." The casual tone hurt more than the betrayal itself. Ethan set the untouched coffee cups on the table. "It was a big deal to me." Lucas tried to step closer, but Ethan backed away. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Lucas said. "That's the problem," Ethan replied softly. "You didn't mean anything at all." He walked out of the office before Lucas could stop him. The following days blurred together. Lucas sent messages, sometimes apologizing, sometimes insisting the situation had been exaggerated. Each text felt like an attempt to smooth over something that could never return to its original shape. Sleep became difficult, and the apartment filled with reminders Ethan no longer wanted to face. Finally, one morning before sunrise, Ethan packed a small bag and left. He drove without a destination, letting the empty Texas highways carry him farther away from the city. The landscape stretched endlessly around him, fields and distant fences glowing under the early light. Hours later, somewhere along a quiet rural road, his car sputtered and rolled to a stop. Ethan sighed, resting his head briefly against the steering wheel. A few minutes passed before the distant sound of hoofbeats reached him. When Ethan stepped out of the car, he saw a rider approaching across the dusty road. The man sat confidently on horseback, guiding the animal with effortless control. As he drew closer, the rider removed his hat, revealing calm blue eyes and a weathered but kind expression. "Car trouble?" the man asked. Ethan nodded. The cowboy dismounted smoothly and examined the engine with practiced hands. After a moment he closed the hood and looked back at Ethan. "I'm Caleb Dawson," he said. "My ranch is just down the road. We can tow this over there and figure out what's wrong." Something about Caleb's quiet certainty made Ethan feel unexpectedly at ease. As the sun dipped lower over the Texas fields that evening, Ethan found himself sitting on the wooden porch of the ranch house, watching the sky burn orange across the horizon. Caleb stepped outside and leaned against the railing beside him. "Rough day?" Caleb asked. Ethan stared out at the endless landscape and nodded slowly. Caleb didn't press for details. Instead he simply watched the sunset in silence. After a moment, he said calmly, "Sometimes the worst days are the ones that send you exactly where you need to go." Ethan wasn't sure why those words stayed with him, but as the sky darkened and the quiet ranch stretched around him, he felt the first faint sense that leaving the city might have led him somewhere unexpected. Morning arrived without ceremony. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets rinsed and reflective, and the quiet in Lucas's apartment felt deliberate, as if it had been negotiated overnight. I woke before him, or perhaps he had never slept at all. I lay still on the couch, cataloging the weight of what I had acknowledged and the absence of what I had not done. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like standing on a threshold with no map. Lucas stirred eventually and offered a careful greeting, his voice neutral, respectful. We moved through the small rituals of departure, coffee poured, keys located, without revisiting the night. When I left, he hugged me briefly, a gesture that was neither intimate nor distant, and said he hoped I'd get home safe. I promised I would. The promise felt symbolic, and insufficient. Madeline noticed the difference immediately. She always did. I came home quieter, my answers trimmed of warmth. She asked about the storm, about work, about the weekend ahead, and I answered honestly where I could and vaguely where I couldn't. The space between us expanded, not from anger but from omission. I began to realize how much of our life together depended on the assumption that I was whole and unconflicted. Over the following days, Lucas pulled back. Our conversations returned to work, efficient and public. He didn't ignore me, but he no longer offered the attentive silences that had drawn me in. I felt the loss acutely, more than I expected, and that frightened me. I had told myself the night was an anomaly, a moment of confusion, but confusion didn't linger like this. It didn't rearrange priorities or make absence feel like deprivation. Ryan asked if everything was okay, his tone casual but his eyes searching. I deflected with humor, then regretted it. The truth felt heavier with every person who didn't know it. I began to understand Lucas's earlier words about exhaustion, about the cost of being hidden. I was hiding from everyone, including myself, and it was wearing me thin. The confrontation with Madeline wasn't dramatic. It was quieter, which made it harder to endure. She asked why I seemed elsewhere even when I was sitting beside her. She asked if there was someone else, and the question landed between us with devastating clarity. I could have denied it in a technical sense. I could have argued semantics. Instead, I told her I had crossed a line emotionally, that I had let myself care in a way that threatened what we had built. Madeline listened, her composure steady until it wasn't. She didn't ask for names or details. She asked why. I told her the truth as best I could, without excuses or self-pity. I told her I didn't know who I was anymore, and that I was sorry for discovering it at her expense. The apology felt inadequate, but it was the only honest thing I had left to offer. The engagement ended not with a decision but with an understanding. We both recognized that continuing would require a denial neither of us deserved. Packing up my things felt surreal, a dismantling of a future that had once felt inevitable. I carried the guilt with me, aware that self-discovery did not absolve harm. Lucas and I didn't speak for weeks after that. The distance was necessary, a pause that allowed consequences to settle. When we finally met again, it was by chance, in a coffee shop we had both frequented long before any of this. He looked the same, indifferent, familiar, and newly guarded. We talked cautiously, acknowledging the damage without assigning blame. He told me he wouldn't be a secret, not again. I told him I understood, and meant that too. Time did what time does. It dulled the sharpest edges without erasing the shape of what had happened. I began to live more deliberately, questioning assumptions I had once accepted without thought. I learned that identity wasn't something you declared once and defended forever. It was something you discovered through attention and honesty, often at a cost. When Lucas and I chose to try again, it was without illusion. There were no grand promises, only an agreement to be visible and accountable. We moved slowly, aware that trust rebuilt itself in increments. Some nights, the weight of the past pressed close, reminding me of what I had lost and whom I had hurt. Other nights, the quiet felt earned. That I don't frame that night as a turning point because it didn't transform me overnight. It revealed me, and revelation is only the beginning. The line I crossed wasn't about orientation or labels. It was about truth. And once I saw it clearly, there was no returning to the certainty I had worn like armor. There was only the ongoing work of becoming honest, one choice at a time, and the knowledge that some nights change everything not by what happens, but by what can no longer be denied.